What is up, fellow sickos? I am Dan Valley coming at you solo to talk a little bit about Jimmy Butler, Shams Charania of ESPN dropped a grenade on Christmas. Not necessarily one we weren't expecting, but just reporting that Jimmy Butler would prefer a trade out of Miami in advance of free agency. And the crux of the report was basically anchored in not just his future, but his being caught off guard by Pat Riley's comments at the end of last season. Pat Riley has since commented on it because Pat Riley is basically a front office gangster, and I love it at this point. Lots to dig into, but if you're new around here, please remember to subscribe, join our Discord. The link to that's in the podcast description. Great discussions going on there all over the place. Grant and I will be back later this week for our usual Saturday podcast. I think we have a fun topic in store for you. I know. So yeah, if you're checking this out for the first time, be sure to subscribe across all platforms. Ratings and reviews on Spotify and Apple, they help us a ton to come up the charts as well. In addition to liking and commenting on YouTube, we appreciate you all who give us that support and help the algo love us back throughout the year. The basis of this podcast, though, I think is going to be, I'm just going to go through some of the destinations that I think that we know Jimmy Butler listed, then talk about some dark horses. We'll talk about the plausibility behind everything and ultimately how we see this coming out. Without further delay, though, let's hop to it. Let's get to the bullet points of everything that's going on so far before we get into the teams. Butler has a $52.4 million player option he will decline for next season. Pat Riley has since come out and said that these rumors are a distraction and the Miami Heat will not be trading Jimmy Butler. We've heard that type of front office speak before from others. Butler reportedly prefers a trade to the Golden State Warriors, the Dallas Mavericks, the Phoenix Suns, or the Houston Rockets. When you're looking at the landscape, if we're getting into does Jimmy Butler have any leverage here? He does because of free agency. But when you look at the free agency landscape, Brooklyn is right now the only team that's projected to probably have enough cap space to sign him outright if he wants his max salary. However, there are other teams, Detroit, Washington, San Antonio, a few others that they have a pathway to getting there if they need to or if they want Jimmy Butler. You can also look at sign-in trades, which is probably the Heat's biggest form of leverage here too, is that the market is so lacking of cap space that if he wants to leave, he's eventually going to need their help, whether that's in the middle of the season or is it over the summer via a sign-in trade. There could be an opt-in trade as well. With that said, if I had to guess, I think Jimmy Butler is going to get traded by the deadline. You don't want to risk losing him for nothing. If there is a dark horse team out there that maybe goes about creating cap space, or even if you're able to sign and trade or complete an opt-in trade, it's very rarely, unless he isn't going to have a market, that you're going to get as much in a sign and trade as you would if you're trading someone just in the middle of the year when their contract essentially isn't up. I know we're talking about a few months difference here, but he's 35, so he's not getting any younger. Those few extra months matter. And if no team is going to trade for him and then lose him, like if the price drops low enough where the Heat just say, we want to get off his money and get whatever we can, and we're just taking back expiring contracts, maybe there's a team or two or five that would just take a half season rental on Jimmy Butler. But if you're the Heat and you want some type of first round equity or the prospect equivalent, you're going to trade Jimmy Butler, maybe not necessarily to the teams that he has listed, but to a team that has already had the ability to talk to him. You're obviously going to give them that right if you're in trade negotiations. And that team knows that they're almost overwhelmingly going to keep him. And so I kind of believe that he is going to get traded this season. Anyone hoping for fireworks in the lead up to the trade deadline, I think we'll get that big name. And I think he will be the biggest name moved, because you would have to make the case, and you can go check out our trade deadline big board where we at least discussed it, that there's a more valuable player or more impactful player theoretically up for grabs. And it's him or Zach LaVine or the two names that are going to be there. Maybe you could make a case for a Zion Williamson flyer if he ends up getting moved. Does someone come out of left field and wind up hitting the trade market? But that kind of spoils the topic that's to come. So I'm not going to get into the De'Aaron Fox or the Anthony Davis or the LaMelo Ball of it all. So I think he gets moved. I think it's probably in the Heat's best interest to move him, because I think they get more now than they will if they're exploring sign and trade or opt-in trade scenarios. And we know that the Sixers ended up making out quite well in the James Harden trade. I would just say I feel like it's a little different because Harden's market was worse than finite, whereas Jimmy Butler might have a finite market, but there might just be teams that are willing to grease the wheels to an extent of, hey, can we clear enough? If Jimmy Butler wants $35 million a year, how do we get to that number? And there will be teams that are at least flexible enough to say, hey, like if you need to carve out a bunch of cap space, you look at not just the Nets, who will certainly take on contracts, but maybe the Pistons will be there, depending on how much flexibility the Wizards have. And just also the new rules that allow you to take players in to your mid-level exception, that will benefit teams that might want to clear out cap space over the summer. And I think, yes, Jimmy Butler is on the older side, but I really do believe there'll be more teams that will be inclined to do that for him this summer ahead of his age 36 season than there were with James Harden, just because I think what Jimmy Butler does is just more scalable than what James Harden does. I know Jimmy Butler's not the greatest shooter, but he has just more experience playing off the ball, and the defense you get from him, I think it just makes him more scalable, even at an older age. So my guess is, though, he gets traded mid-season because that he does have some real leverage here. Moving on to the list of teams, though, we'll begin with the Dallas Mavericks here. They're interesting, and I want to dispel a notion that Dallas has to trade Kyrie Irving if they want to obtain Jimmy Butler. They really don't have to. And I'll throw up, if you're watching on YouTube, a trade, just a framework of a trade where that would get you Jimmy Butler. It's just you have to ask yourself. And as I'm recording this, we don't have any word on how long of a time Luka Doncic is going to be out with that calf strain he suffered on Christmas, just that the Mavs were bracing for an extended period of time. I don't know if this makes it more likely that they should think about a Jimmy Butler trade or less likely because, if one of our best players isn't going to be healthy. At the same time, does it make it easier to keep our heads above water while he's gone? And then when he comes back, we just have this three-headed monster with Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, and Jimmy Butler. Big threes to that degree are prohibitive, bordering on an impossibility in the new salary cap climate, because we know franchises aren't going to exist, inside the second apron or with these, even before the aprons, the second apron, you never saw these teams, very few that were just in the luxury tax until Kingdom Come and repeatedly doing it. So there's always this, because you would get more punitive the more expensive you got. There's always going to be a limit. And so I probably would not be off rip an advocate of the Mavs going this route. They don't need Jimmy Butler at full strength. I think that they've clearly established themselves as the second best team in the West behind the Oklahoma City Thunder. And they're a viable championship threat. If you're looking for that extra oomph and you're saying, well, Jimmy Butler fills a bunch of boxes because of what he does defensively, and he gives us that third bankable guy who can create for himself and others in the half court in a playoff setting. Whereas right now it's, do you count on, let's say, a Spencer Dinwiddie giving you a ton of minutes in that setting and then those minutes being good? I don't know that you can necessarily say that. That, I think, would be the motivation, coupled with, all right, this makes it a little bit easier, or a lot easier, I should say, to exist without Luka Doncic. The package though, is it's honestly not like an implausible amount, but when you're kind of looking at the value that the Heat would need to return there. So I think it would be, it's going to be like a 3 or 4 team deal. The one I have mapped out would be the Mavs get Jimmy Butler. The Bulls get Tim Hardaway Jr., Jaden Ivey, and Daniel Gafford. The Pistons get Zach LaVine, Torrey Craig, and Alec Burks. Miami gets Simone Fontecchio, Maxi Kleber, Najee Marshall, Klay Thompson. Dallas's first round pick. There will be seconds sprinkled in there. And it should be noted, I don't have it included here, Dallas can trade a 2031 first too, but you just get into just some really mind-melting questions of, are you giving up a 2031 first round pick for Jimmy Butler? The Mavericks know they're going to keep him. He wants to be in Dallas. And so that behooves them to say, okay, we can trade for Jimmy Butler. No, we're going to keep him. But just the tenability of having to keep this thing together and make upgrades from there, I will say, on paper, look, the cost, the Heat, they're getting like a lot of short-term money here, and you're not getting a blue chip prospect. You're just getting a first-round pick and some seconds. Maybe the Klay Thompson addition is a sticking point, and that like gets a little weird. Like, can you finagle something? Like, does Quentin Grimes have to be included in this? Do they have any interest in Olivier Maxence Prosper? Could he be on the move in the deal? You can talk about the merits of the Bulls and the Pistons through this. I would trade, I said this on the podcast, Jaden Ivey and salary for Zach LaVine. I would just do it if I'm Detroit. And if you're the Bulls, to get off that money while getting worse, and then you get a flyer on Jaden Ivey and Daniel Gafford. Like, if you think that Vooch isn't going to be long for there, reuniting with Daniel Gafford, like, his deal is fine. And Tim Hardaway Jr. comes off the books next year. So I think it's pretty easy to justify from their end. If maybe does Detroit or the Bulls, like, do they need some sort of second round compensation here? The Heat would be the sticking point. They're getting a bunch of useful players, but is this enough first round equity? I don't know what type of leverage. Like, who is theoretically of the teams that have been mentioned that Jimmy Butler wants to go to? Are you sure you're going to get more? We'll get into that. Maybe from Golden State, maybe from Houston. I guess if you value what Phoenix would technically give you. For Dallas, though, I will say on paper to have Luka Doncic, Jimmy Butler, Kyrie Irving, PJ Washington, and Derek Lively in the same rotation is kind of nuts. And by kind of, I mean definitely nuts. But you're knifing into depth that has made you insanely valuable this season. And the other thing here, too, is you're really obliterating the size on your front line by trading away Maxi Kleba and Daniel Gafford. You could probably get into expanded permutations where is Gafford or Kleba staying and you're using Dwight Powell salary to get out of there. And then there's an Olivier Max that's Prosper. But that would be even more complicated than this. This was more to show everybody that the Mavs can trade for Jimmy Butler without having to include a PJ Washington or a Kyrie Irving, let alone a Luka Doncic. But that's a tough sell for me if I'm Dallas. And by the way, you're not giving up too much. You're giving up a large part of your rotation. Plus, the first round equity is just whatever. So you're giving up that one first round pick. And if the Heat are going to accept that, I think you can deal with, all right, there is a downgrade in spacing when you're getting rid of Klay Thompson, even Maxi Kleba, and then going to Jimmy Butler. But just the talent upgrade there itself is so huge. And so I think in a vacuum, when you're looking at what the Mavs are giving up, which is a lot of players who are useful to them, and a first round pick, I think it's reasonable. I just can't get there if I'm Dallas, because if you want to keep the bulk of your core intact, it's just impossible without consolidating. Like, even if you threw PJ Washington into here, like, there might be a different framework there, but then you're losing one of your most valuable role players and defenders that you have right now. And just to spare keeping like another true center, I might even, if you're going to trade for Jimmy Butler, I think I'd probably prefer this route, figure out a way to, go get another center. Maybe you sign Bismack Biyombo off the scrap heap there, and you can play PJ Washington even more in the middle. If you're going to go that route, I think this is the direction that I would favor. It's just a lot for the Mavericks, and to have that kind of seismic upheaval in the middle of the year, it's always tough, but to do so when, again, at full strength, you're one of the two best teams in the Western Conference. I know Memphis and Houston are in front of them in the standings as we talk about this. Maybe it becomes more palatable, like I said, if Luka Doncic is going to miss time, but you could also argue that the depth there becomes incredibly important. Point being, though, if they want to, like, this isn't a situation that needs to cost them Derek Lively or Kyrie Irving or PJ Washington. It would be a matter of, well, what is Miami's asking price here? And I think this offer could be beaten. I just don't know how, of the teams that are on Jimmy Butler's list, I really only think there's like one of them that might be inclined to say, well, we're definitely going to come over the top and get this. One of the next teams on Jimmy Butler's list, the Golden State Warriors, they have the Mavericks deal was the only one that I'm really like going to super specifically outlay because they were in a complicated situation. The Dubs, to me, of all the teams on the list, make the most sense when you're looking at, do they have the incentive and the motivation to go get Jimmy Butler, the plausibility behind them building a package that Miami would accept, and then Jimmy Butler wanting to go there. They're on his list. You have Jonathan Kuminga, you have Brandon Podziemski. Moses Moody can still be moved, even though he's poison pilled. That's still a pretty easy contract to flip. You have Andrew Wiggins as the salary anchor. That essentially has to happen. I mean, you could get there, I think, without including Andrew Wiggins, but it's trading literally everybody that's not Draymond Green and Steph. And literally is an over exaggeration. But if Golden State really is determined to make the most of what remains of the Steph window, this is probably the most interesting landing spot to me. And it's tough giving up Andrew Wiggins, but you can kind of still do so because Jimmy Butler's a wing himself without obliterating your wing depth there. And so, yes, it's going to cost you like other money, is like Kevon Looney going out, is Gary Payton II going out. If you're making this deal at the buzzer, Dennis Schroeder could technically be going out there. I think if the net cost is a first, like they have 3 tradable first round picks, the cleanest structure would be 25, 27, and then, or it would have to be 25 and 27 or 26 and 28. And then you trade the 2030 pick that you owe technically to Washington. But if you're the Heat that's acquiring this pick, that Washington only gets that first rounder if it falls between 21 and 30. So if you're the Heat looking at the long-term future of the Warriors, 6 years, 5 years down the line, and you're saying we get their first round pick in 2030 if it lands in the top 20, you're banking on them not being essentially a top 10 team in the NBA at that point. I think that's a reasonable gamble to make. If it cost the Warriors 2 first round picks and a kid, they'll just throw Kuminga or Pods in there. And then Wiggins, I don't know why. It's just because Jimmy Butler's on the older end. Ideally, if you're giving up Wiggins, which you are, it'd be Wiggins, a kid, and a first. And so is it like a 2027 first? It's not going to be this year's first. Maybe if you view it as, well, like how valuable is this year's first? I'm walking away if I'm the Warriors, if it's more than 2 firsts, Wiggins, and a kid. I just don't. I'm not a big believer in what we need to worry about what we are after Steph and Draymond retire, but more so Steph. You need to leave yourself with something. And it's not like you're getting someone in the heart of their prime here. It'd be different if it's Anthony Davis, who's age 31. It's a completely different beast when it's Jimmy Butler, who is age 35. So if it's a younger star that they're going after, I think that's when you can talk yourself into like trading more. Nobody's aside from Steph. If Miami wants Draymond, I'm considering it. I picked him when we did our awards ballots. I think I had him third in defensive player. I don't think it was second. He is not, and the Warriors defense has not just looked the same basically ever since we recorded that. So that's going to look like because Grant didn't even have him in his top 3. That'll look like a mega miss on my end. But for Golden State, I actually like the fit. You would appreciate if Jimmy Butler had more of a higher volume jump shooting game, but his ability to get to the foul line, the pressure he puts on the basket, his value as a playmaker, his value at the defensive end, and just the archetype of player he is, it makes it easier for you to give up, I'll say, Andrew Wiggins and Jonathan Kuminga in the same trade and not feel the ramifications of that positional or archetypal scarcity. And I don't think Kuminga's a wing anyway, so that's a different story here. I'm probably making the move though. If it's 2 firsts plus Wiggins and a kid, that's where it really gets tough for me. But if you're holding on to, like, if it's 25 and 27, so you're kind of front loading this deal, plus Kuminga, plus Wiggins, and then there'll be other money to fill it in, I'd probably still do it because then you still have control over like your picks post 2027. And that's where this could get, is that the balance for both sides to me is 2 firsts, Wiggins, and a kid. And you're not getting any of those long-term first rounders. And if you're Miami, I mean, you owe your 2027 pick to Charlotte technically elsewhere. Having a Warriors pick in that year, that could be like, that could hold value. They're the team that I think makes the most sense. If we're having this discussion over the offseason, maybe it's a different story, but of the teams that are on the list, I think Golden State by far and away makes the most sense. I just don't know how motivated they are to make that deal given their most recent slide. And you could take the Dennis Schroeder deal one of 2 ways. I argued it was good that they acted early, and I still do believe that on what should theoretically be one of their bigger needs. But you could also view it through the lens of, they're not trying to make the home run swing. Otherwise, they would have waited because, yes, Dennis Schroeder can be aggregated again, but it's not until basically right before the trade deadline. So maybe there's like a happy medium in between there. Who knows? I questioned, though, Golden State's front office, and I did say this at the time of the trade. I think it was probably a good indicator of how invested they are in the current timeline that they got Dennis Schroeder, but I don't know if they're so invested that they're prepared to go after someone like a Jimmy Butler. The next team up, I think, will be, I don't want to say everyone's favorite or most likely destination, but when you're talking about this on TV or maybe a national podcast that isn't as awesome as the Hardwood Knocks NBA podcast, this is one example. Everyone probably gravitates towards Houston, which is just built to make a consolidation trade. They can't play all the guys that we're already seeing it. So you have all these young guys and Amen Thompson, Reed Shepard, Cam Whitmore, Jabari Smith Jr., and Tari Eason. Alperen Sengun and Jalen Green are trade eligible, but the deal becomes a lot more complicated because of their poison pills. It would be more straightforward, I think, if you wanted to go after Jimmy Butler, if it was something that happened over the offseason as a sign-in trade or an opt-in trade, and you're able to use Jalen Green as the primary salary anchor. Still, you could move one of those guys now. You could also match salaries without using those guys now because you have Fred VanVleet, you have Dylan Brooks, you have those other their expiring contracts, or they have the non-guarantees on the back end, looking at Jock Landale, you have Jeff Green, Jayshawn Tate's money. Those are all just sort of middle of the rung where you can ensure Miami doesn't have to take back any bad contracts. One, Houston doesn't have a single bad contract on its books. Jalen Green's is probably the worst deal on the books, and that's at least short-term enough to where it's not a toxic contract, you would say. There's a bunch of different permutations here. I think in a Jimmy Butler trade negotiation, if the Rockets want to do it, I'm not giving up Reed Shepherd. I'm not giving up Amen Thompson. I probably wouldn't want to give up Tari Eason, but there could be some redundancy there. I'm saying, hey, we'll get to the money, and maybe that's Fred VanVleet. Maybe it's Dylan Brooks, plus, is Jabari Smith in there? Is Cam Whitmore in there? You have Jock Landale, Jeff Green. You're expanding it to 3 and 4 teams so that they could make some of the roster spot math a little bit easier to work out. And then I'm building it around picks. They can trade up to 4 first-round picks. They have, I think, 9 over the next 7 years, but because of their own draft obligations, you're really looking at, they can promise 4 first-rounders right now. 2 first-rounders and a kid plus money, and I would say you could argue all these kids are primary kids. I love Jabari Smith Jr. That's just not somebody I'm throwing in. If I'm Houston and I'm looking at it, I'm going the route of money, no kids and picks. And that's what I'm offering the Heat. And if you want a kid, maybe Cam Whitmore at this point, just because you question his viability with this team long term. Even then, and I might be just romanticizing the unknown here, the Rockets are good already. And Jimmy Butler simultaneously addresses one of their bigger needs without doing so. Their half-court offense, first chance offense, however you want to frame it, it's still mediocre at best. But I do think that if you're going to go for someone who can help you there, it's probably better that they're more of a floor spacer, just because eventually you have Alperen Sengun for one, but eventually you are going to want to expand, I would think, the type of usage you're getting out of Amen Thompson. And Jimmy Butler, if you're trying to keep him around long-term, you could make it work, but are you optimizing your roster with Jimmy Butler or the supporting cast? Or your most important kids, are they being optimized through the acquisition of Jimmy Butler? You can make a case that they won't be, or that some of them won't be. And that's why you don't empty the stockpile now. It's also kind of the mind, okay, you have one of the best point differentials in the league against top 10 teams, and you're contending for a top 2 spot in the Western Conference. Yes, experience matters. Yes, we need to see what their offense looks like in the playoff setting. Get there, get the information, leave, and then make adjustments. So I'm not trading for Jimmy Butler if I'm Houston. There's a shorter list of names that I think, okay, I'd roll the dice and I'd make the move now. If it's a De'Aaron Fox, if it's a LaMelo Ball, just to name 2, I'm looking at that and saying, okay, I think they're a good enough fit. And you look at their age, makes it easier, certainly, that I will act now. But with Jimmy Butler, it helps you in negotiations because Miami doesn't have a ton of leverage. And you could argue maybe Jimmy Butler doesn't have a ton himself. I do think he is more than Miami in this situation. So if the cost is just that appealing to where it's money, picks, and a kid of Houston's choosing, let's say maybe Houston wants it to be Reed Shepherd for all I know. They don't, but I'm just saying, consider it. I don't think Houston's going to win the title as currently constructed. That's okay where they're at in their timeline without making this move. And look, they're not going to probably win the title if they acquire Jimmy Butler anyway, even if you think he's an ideal fit, which, look, there's a case to be made. And if the cost is just can't miss, then we talk. But these midseason acquisitions, they almost always, unless you're talking about one of the most scalable players in the NBA offensively, which I do think requires a skill from beyond the arc, or at least as a jump shooter away from the ball that Jimmy Butler just does not have, it takes time to hash out. And so you're almost making a trade midseason with your eye toward future seasons. That's tough to do when you're one this good. It's even, as Houston is, it's 2 even harder to do when your timeline with Jimmy Butler isn't really open-ended anyway. How many more years can you count on Jimmy Butler being even at all-star level, let's say, which I think is just reasonable? The rest of this year, next year, then it's probably just iffy after that. If you want to say this season and 2 more, I'll allow it. I mean, can I disallow it? If I can, I'm probably going to hit that veto button, but you can't even guarantee that, which is the problem. So I don't love, it'd be different if Houston was just sort of twiddling their thumbs and they're hovering in no man's land, but they've been a good team this year. They're not a finished product. I don't view them as a tier 1. title contender. And I don't think they're tier 2 just because I think OKC and Cleveland and Boston might even just stand alone in tier 1, or maybe it's just Boston and OKC alone in tier 1. But to be a tier 3 at worst title contender, to be not just in the discussion with the Phoenix Suns, the Denver Nuggets, the Minnesota Timberwolves, but to be in front of those teams, like that's a big deal without having made any wholesale changes. So I'm not opposed to it if I'm Houston, but I would bet against it. And if I was running Houston, no, I'm not making a Jimmy Butler trade this season. The next team up, the Phoenix Suns, they're another team where it's just we should go through the trade framework because there's only like you're trading Bradley Beal and your 2031 first. There's no negotiating. You give the Heat everything that you have, which is that deal would look like the one that I mocked up. You have Jimmy Butler going to the Suns. The Heat get Bradley Beal. The Suns is 2031 first. The Suns is 2031 second. And then 2 more seconds via the Nuggets that the Suns own. I think they're in 26 and 2031. You also do need to send out another player. Let's send Alec Burks to the Sixers. They should have no problem with this. They're getting Jimmy Butler out of the Eastern Conference, and they're just kind of bolstering their guard depth. You can take him in the minimum exception. Doesn't need to be the Sixers. You want to send him to Detroit? It could be Detroit. It could basically be any team. It's easier if they have an open roster spot to do it. And I don't think you're ideally eyeing a team that wouldn't ask for compensation for taking on Alec Burks. That's the deal. But Beal is owed $110 million over the next 2 seasons, and he has a no-trade clause. You need to get him to waive it, and I think he might. I know that people have said that he won't. I think he might. I think the bigger hurdle is probably convincing the Heat to accept this. You're not getting any sort of immediate return. You're basically looking at this as, well, we're really shorting the shit out of Phoenix's future. And look, that's a smart bet to make because they're getting older with this trade. And it's just, you look at a team built around all of a sudden Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, Jimmy Butler, and no picks. What are they going to be in 20 and 31? They're arguably, like, maybe they've recouped some value, maybe even some of their own picks via Houston if they traded Devin Booker by that point. It's a good bet to make, but you have to value Bradley Beal through a prism of, well, we're still trying to be competitive because we're not flush with our own picks. We're not flush with all these future picks either after a Jimmy Butler trade. We think Beal could help us at least be mediocre. Maybe he's even better in Miami and healthier in Miami than he's been in Phoenix. And we're just sort of treading water there. And we don't think the drop off will be that big going from Jimmy Butler to Bradley Beal. That's quite the leap to make. And I don't think that, I mean, Butler's giving you a list where I think there's probably, of the 4, I'm going to say that the only team that feels like it's an absolute no-go for, it's probably between Houston and Dallas, and it might be both of them. Dallas feels like more of the no-go. We need to see what ends up going on with Luka Doncic, but even then, it's what's got them here is just like all of a sudden they're more dynamic and deeper on offense, and what's happening going from that package we outlaid to Jimmy Butler. Maybe you're just as dynamic on offense, but your depth certainly isn't there, and you're smaller because part of the appeal of Dallas is just they're fucking huge, and Jimmy Butler's not small, but when you're trading 2 bigs that are in your rotation when they're healthy, on top of Klay Thompson, on top of Najee Marshall, who has great size, I would say Dallas is probably more of a non-starter than Houston just because there's always the chance that if Houston doesn't have to give up any of their youngsters and it's just picks and salary, that they could probably talk themselves into it. So I don't think that Jimmy Butler, what I'm saying is giving you a list that is restrictive enough to the point where he's basically saying it's Phoenix or bust. And if he eventually comes out and says that, or if Golden State and Houston and Dallas all say, whoa, no way, fuck this, we're not doing it. Maybe you just look at this and say, okay, we'll take it. Like, I think you have to look at it this way. What is this really damaging about Miami's plans moving forward? You could say that Beal contract is toxic. If you get him to also waive his no trade, like just retract his no trade clause in general as part of this trade, it's probably an easier sell. But if you're the Heat and you become bad enough, maybe Beal will be more flexible with his no trade clause because he'll just want to be on a good team at that point. I don't know. It's a big bet to make and to walk away with nothing of real immediacy. I mean, it'd be really funny if there was a team in the East that would take on Alec Burks and then maybe just send the Heat like a good second because they're saying, well, like this gets Jimmy Butler out of the East. And so we're not worried about Miami being good necessarily with him, but what if they did trade him somewhere in the Eastern Conference that could be good? Notably, though, no Eastern Conference team makes his list. So and you go through that, and we will, because we're going to go through dark horses, and it's, well, what team is coming over the top there? I just don't. I don't think some people have laughed this scenario off more than I think they should. I give it some merit. I do think there will ultimately be more attractive offers out there. If it was Phoenix or bust for Jimmy, and maybe he gets to that point, it's probably an easier sell. Or what we haven't mentioned, what Phoenix could do. Is there a way that you can use Grayson Allen is the name probably that gets you any first round equity? I don't see a team there that's going to give you a first round pick for just any of the Suns' standalone value players. I would assume Grayson Allen still comes the closest. I can't see it happening with Royce O'Neal. You're definitely not getting one for Yusuf Nurkic. I don't think anyone, if they just said, hey, we'll trade Oso Ighodaro or Ryan Dunn to someone for a first, maybe that's the mechanics by which you get it done. Are you willing to do that? Like, if someone was going to give you a first for Ryan Dunn, I don't know that it's going to, you drafted Ryan Dunn at number 28. The cost control there and him being more of a known commodity than maybe of a future pick. Could there be someone that looks at that and says, yeah, okay, hey, we'll do that? That would be interesting. So if you're somehow getting a 2025 first round pick for Ryan Dunn, does that, and it's not going to be a good first round pick, but as Miami, are you all of a sudden, just because Phoenix can't aggregate salaries, so it can't be Ryan Dunn and Bradley Beal. I don't, what team is giving you the first for Ryan Dunn? It's just so, I don't think you're going to get one from Indiana for it. It has to be a team that is somewhat good. That's really interesting. I don't know if there's maybe, okay, would Dallas do it? I mean, then they're facilitating Jimmy Butler. Like, oh, we'll give you our 2025 pick for a flyer on Dunn who could just defend his ass off. But then it's, oh, we just helped. Like, that's also a thing of all this is, oh, okay, that just helped Phoenix get Jimmy Butler. Why would we do that? As Dallas specifically, if you're a team in the West that doesn't view Phoenix as a rival, I guess if you're so good, if you're Dallas, you're like, oh, Phoenix with Jimmy Butler or whatever, like they'll be just as fragile. They'll be just as shallow. This is fine. But if you're a team that maybe doesn't view yourself on Jimmy Butler, like that's when you look at it. But now you're removing a lot of just the good teams from the West from the equation. And I mean, look at it. Maybe the Knicks would give you their Washington first for Ryan Dunn, but that's not a guaranteed first. It's super complicated. I mean, would Boston do it? Like, they just have some of these other firsts floating around. It's like, yeah, we'll get another cost-controlled wing here. We might end up trading Jaylen Brown or maybe a Drew Holiday at some point anyway, cut the bill. Is that, like, could that be? And then Boston says, okay, hey, we're getting Jimmy Butler out of the East. We don't care. We don't view anyone as our peers anyway. That is interesting. I don't know if it's, I mean, but then Boston, you could find somewhere to send Jaden Springer. Like, just, they can't be Phoenix, but you could find somewhere to trade Jaden Springer to make that happen. Boston would be, so they would trade their first round pick this year, which is going to be number 29. So like number 29, 28, 27. Are you saying, okay, bottom 5 first round pick for Ryan Dunn? I mean, Phoenix if you're Phoenix, you're not doing that in a vacuum. You're doing it because you can partner that first. And maybe are you also getting, Boston has seconds? Like that might be the most compelling case for Phoenix. And then could you get other stuff for Grayson Allen or Roy, maybe seconds? Like that is probably the way because I think you need something immediate to send Miami. And so if you're getting a 2025 first, Boston could also trade a 2026 first if they want to protect the hell out of it. It's like, would you do that for Ryan Dunn? Maybe some people don't think he's shown enough, but as a flyer and you're Boston and you're going to give up, let's just be, if the season ended today, you're giving up the number 28 pick. So let's just pencil it in there. If anything, it might be worse because maybe they finish with a better record than Cleveland or Oklahoma City. Number 28 and Bradley Beal and the 2031 Suns pick and all the seconds for Jimmy Butler. I do think that's probably the best path for Phoenix is can we trade someone else? It doesn't necessarily have to be Ryan Dunn to get a more immediate pick that we can send Miami. And that's the way that your trade offer becomes more intriguing. Those are the teams on Jimmy Butler's list. There will be some dark horses. Someone will emerge. I don't know who, but I think there are a bunch of teams that are worth talking about. I think let's begin with the Spurs. I think that they're probably most commonly mentioned as a dark horse. I don't hate it. like there's a value to just having these steadying, really good veterans on the team around Victor Wembanyama, around Devin Vassell, Steph Castle, and it can clearly help. I don't hate his fit in San Antonio. He gives you value at both ends of the floor. I would just prefer someone who either needs to be on the ball even less than a Jimmy Butler or is just a better floor spacer away from it than Jimmy Butler, because there's going to come a time where you want to expand Steph Castle's role. And I know Victor Wembanyama counts as a floor spacer, but like when you have Victor Wembanyama, it would be cool if you could hit the 5-out button more frequently than the Spurs can. And that's to say at all, which they really just can't. And they could. But it's more of a stretch to get there. Man, no, they have contracts to make it happen. You don't have to give up Steph Castle or Devin Vassell, and you get to keep Wemby clearly. Like, if you're giving up enough first-round picks to where Zach Collins is out of there as well, you have Harrison Barnes, you have Keldon Johnson too. I don't hate it. And if we're talking 2 first-round pick, if it's 1 first-round pick, if it's just you get Atlanta's 2027 pick and we're done, or is it you want that Bulls pick and we're done, in addition to maybe you're giving some flyers on, is it a Blake Wesley? I don't know how much interest the Heat would have in him, but if that's the structure, you might as well just from a sheer value play. Okay, it cost us 1 future first round pick in salary. You're not necessarily married to Keldon Johnson or Harrison Barnes, and certainly not Zach Collins. If it's 2, it's got to be like somewhat weak of a second one to where you're protecting the hell out of it. But if you're giving up 1 Hawks pick and salary and an additional first, I think protected first, I think it's worth considering from San Antonio's end. I just don't think the fit is seamless enough to say, hey, go do this now. And it's also, look, it's a weird time to do it now. You need to know that Jimmy Butler's staying, of course. You're 11th in the West. And so you're hovering around 500. Do you view Jimmy Butler as the impetus that is going to, because you're not really making that trade just for a crack at the play-in. It's, hey, we want to bridge the gap, which is only, we're 2 losses behind 6th place. So when we get Jimmy Butler, you're saying we're going to be, we're going to be better than the Warriors, the Timberwolves, the Suns, the Clippers, and the Lakers, just at minimum. Like, those are the teams in front of you right now. And if you also think, oh, we'll be better than Denver, and maybe we don't necessarily trust Memphis for some reason or whatever, I think the Spurs can talk themselves into it. It would be cost dependent for sure. Other teams, the Clippers probably deserve just like a little bit of an honorable mention here. Kawhi for Jimmy Butler and Alec Burks, that just works straight up. I'd be curious, like, why? And if I'm the Clippers, I'm not giving up any first round equity for it, because Kawhi Leonard's the better player when he's healthy. He's just never healthy. And if you're Miami, that's a lot to take on when you're looking at Kawhi's future salary. If you're the Clippers, you're saying, well, maybe we're getting an immediate downgrade and we're getting older when we're looking at both these players are available. Both these players are not available right now. Like, Kawhi Leonard has not been available. So I think the Clippers could say, well, now if this doesn't work out with Butler, he's a short-term contract and we know he's not going to be on as long of an extension as Kawhi Leonard after this. I think there'd be truth serum. You give their front office truth serum, they might even say that they want to do this deal. Miami would have to really think that, all right, we're going to get Kawhi, he's going to come back, and all right, he can only play in 58 games a season, but with him and Bam and Tyler Hero, like, we're going to make it happen. It works. It won't happen, but it works. Sacramento, that's another team where it's all right. I'd like to see, I think Jimmy Butler certainly fits the defensive archetype that they can need. And you are going to have to give up DeMar DeRozan and or Malik Monk in that deal. I'm assuming it'd be one of DeMar and Kevin Huerter, and then you figure out the rest of the money and pick compensation, not giving up Keegan Murray. If you get to keep Keegan Murray and you have De'Aaron Fox and Sabonis and you're bringing in Butler and you kind of just know that that's your core, I don't hate it, but I would like to see, again, better shooting on the offensive end now. And you're going to invariably downgrade your spacing at this, because even if you're only giving up one of Monk or Huerter, that's going to be a downgrade for your spacing. And I know people don't want to see the Kings, who are in 12th place, rush into anything massive. I mean, if it's Devin Carter and a pick, I'm probably doing it. Honestly, I'm probably doing it. And what is Greg Wissinger posted this on Twitter or Blue Sky. I think it was Blue Sky. And he was spot on with it, because we got a lot of comments on the little King spiel that I did a few days ago of that the Kings just need to rebuild. And Greg Wissinger's point of the Kings Herald, they do fantastic work. He does great work. Love one of the best follows just on NBA Twitter in general. He's funny as hell. But Greg had said basically to the effect of, So you don't trust this front office to make the right moves to maximize this roster or to win now, but you trust them to strip it down and start over the right way. If you're arguing for a Kings rebuild, I think you also need to be arguing for a clean sweep where it's new front office, which then means you're getting a new head coach. If that's the path you want the Kings to travel down, then fine. I still think the team is good enough to salvage or to better optimize. And I'm not trading De'Aaron Fox right now. If you want to look at this as it's title or bust, that's how I follow the NBA. It's how I cover it. That's how I root for teams. I think your opinion's legitimate, but I don't think you're not going to sell me on the Kings, certainly like a midseason pivot into a rebuild. You're also not going to sell me on maybe for a specific player. I don't think they should be giving up multiple firsts to try and maximize what's left of this season. If it's Devin Carter and a first, and the Heat might be interested in DeMar DeRozan, where they could say, how much of an offensive drop-off is that for us? And DeMar is still good, so we're kind of getting Devin Carter and a pick. But Kevin Huerter would help them. Malik Monk would help them. Who would you prefer to? You probably want to keep Malik Monk in that scenario to maximize, like who's like an on-ball type shooter too. Saying you don't want to give up. They were already like you're bringing back another on-ball creator, but it's probably for the Kings, it's better as if the two main outgoing salaries are DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Huerter, I think, make the most sense. Maybe you could talk me into Malik Monk. Certainly not over DeMar. I mean, having him, Sabonis, and Jimmy and Fox on the same team, that's just, forget about redundancy. That's overkill to me. I'm probably doing it if I'm Sacramento because I don't think that's it. All right, you gave up. You have one pick that's owed to Atlanta this year, which you're trying to make sure it conveys. Now you have to give up a 2027 pick, and that's going to have language that, well, it's prided on this pick conveying to Atlanta, so it could stretch out into 28, 29. It's not nothing, and Jimmy Butler's older, but do you believe in De'Aaron Fox and Sabonis specifically and Keegan Murray or not? And if you're saying no, you never should have gotten to this point in the first place of having DeMar DeRozan on your team, of then just paying Malik Monk. So that's where I would be at with that. They also have maybe for some reason, maybe they want to keep Devin, like Keon Ellis. If you think he's going to play even less, even though Kevin Huerter and I'm just saying Kevin Huerter and DeMar are leaving. If you think somehow Keon Ellis is going to play even less with Jimmy Butler coming in, he's attractive as hell. And I would just argue I'm calling the Kings about Keon Ellis. I would give up a first round pick for Keon Ellis. The salary is cheap as hell. And it's not going to be, I guess, a great first round pick, but I'm giving up more for Keon Ellis than I am for a Ryan. Boston would give up their first round pick for Keon. That's not even a question. There's a question when it's Ryan Dunn. So they have a bunch of different permutations. And if everything is spending way longer on the Kings, isn't that the story of this season for us on this podcast? Spending way longer on the Kings than I thought I would. I'm doing it. I don't hate the Jimmy Butler fit there. Now, you need to know that because they just have so much, they have optionality of trade packages, which I think that people are also sort of underrating here. You need to know he's staying. And if he's not, you didn't think OG or Pascal Siakam is going to stay. Why would Jimmy Butler be any different? He's at a point where he just might be following the money. So, and the Kings will be good with him is the other thing here too. I would just keep my eye on it. They haven't been mentioning him in the slightest. If Jimmy Butler's willing to expand his list, I think that's a big part of this. If there wasn't a list and this was just Jimmy Butler wants to be traded, maybe they crop up. I don't have any other. I look at the Kings and the Spurs as the dark horses where it's all right. Not only can I talk myself into this, not only can I make a case for this, but I am going to watch those teams. The rest of these teams get a little interesting. Indiana, they're not a team that's going to pay a third star. However, Jarris Walker, Benedict Mathurin, they have future first that they could trade. They have Miles Turner's expiring money. They have the Obi Toppin contract. They can get there. And Jimmy Butler makes a lot of sense on that team, even with his age. Are you planning on paying him, Siakam, and Halliburton moving forward? That opens up all sorts of questions where it's, well, they're eventually going to want to move off Nembhard then. If I'm the Pacers, I'm at least making the call. And what's his interest in staying here long term? And I think what helps about him being older is that maybe you're not looking at him and saying, oh, this guy needs a max deal as part of his next contract, or you can float it for 1 year. If he's going to pick up his player option and make that 52.4 number. But if you're just kind of looking at this and saying, well, we're worried that he wants his next deal to start at max money, it's going to be short term enough to where I'm probably all right, is that kind of the end of the world? But you don't want to give up that much stuff for 2 years worth of Jimmy Butler and having a starting salary of, what is it going to be, 35% of the cap next year is like a mountainous. So 54.1 million would be his max. It's only a little bit extra compared to what his player option is. They won't do it. They should absolutely be in on, like, that's a call you're making and saying, okay, what chance do we have of him wanting to stay here beyond this season? Because Halliburton, Siakam, and Jimmy as just your baseline, you're giving up a lot of stuff to get, like, when we're talking about maybe even relative to the Kings or the Spurs, or when we were talking about the Rockets, this is more in line with, oh, the players we're sending out, like, they're gonna, just because we know Miles Turner will almost assuredly be involved in there, and if he's not, I mean, you've step laddered, you've finessed the shit out of that trade package. You've given up a bunch of first round picks, and then all year, maybe not a bunch, but you've given up first round picks and Toppin and Neesmith and Benedict Mather and Jared. Like, how many teams are involved in that? But what I'm saying is, so either way, this is more comparable to the Warriors package or the Mavericks package that we were discussing, because you're giving up, I would guess, probably 2 players at least that matter to your rotation right now. I'm still looking at it, though. And if I thought they had the guts to do it, I would put the Pacers on this list. I just don't think their front office has the guts, and I won't criticize them for it, because you can't give up what the Pacers would need to give up and then have Jimmy Butler walk. I think, what team would be a good example? I think if you're the Spurs and you gave up Atlanta's 2027 and the rest is just, it wasn't just filler salary, but it was the Barnes, maybe a protected first round pick, and then Jimmy Butler left, you probably say, hey, we tried. Even in the realm of the Kings and giving up that first and Devin Carter, let's just say, with that money of a DeMar DeRozan and Kevin Huerter, you could probably say you can't, and they won't. But it's not on like a cataclysmically bad level. If you're Indy and you've given up Jarris Walker and Benedict Mathurin and a first in addition to Miles Turner and then other stuff, like, so some combination of Turner, Mathurin, Walker, and picks in addition to other stuff, which might include Aaron Neesmith, yeah, that would be a bad look. And that's just why I can't put them on this list. I've thought a lot about Atlanta. I kind of love Jimmy Butler there. He would beef up a defense that has overachieved this season. And I think that they have the contracts necessary and even the pick flexibility necessary. They do have picks headed to San Antonio, but 2026 is a swap, and this year's pick is headed to San Antonio. So maybe like that's a pick San Antonio could throw in as well. But you have 25 and 27 going to San Antonio, and 26 you don't have control over. If you just put like a distant first, you put the Lakers pick on the table, so they have Los Angeles's pick this year. And my point being, you have the salary machinations to say, we don't have to give up Zachary Risacher or Dyson Daniels as part of this deal. And we know they're not going to give up Jalen Johnson or Trae Young. And so you get there with, all right, does it make sense to use some combination of Capella and Hunter and Bogdanovich and Okongwu? Larry Nance Jr. is expiring. They have a bunch of, and other teams would need to be roped in. I think there'd be a team that would just take on Larry Nance Jr. if they have their MLE available, or they're sending out a smaller contract. I think there are plenty of teams that would do something like that. Would you give up a second first round pick just because Kobe Buffkin doesn't have a ton of standalone value right now, especially after the injury? That second first round pick you're giving up, though, is in 2029. Do we get there with swaps where it's a 2028 swap plus the Lakers pick? I don't know if that's enough relative to, like, because the Heat, when you're looking at Capella or Hunter or Bogdanovich, maybe they really like Okongwu and they would value him there. I'm making this deal without giving up Risacher or Daniels. That is how, if I'm Atlanta, that's how I'm approaching this. And I just don't, he's not going to do a ton for your spacing. If you're sending out Hunter and Bogdanovich, you have to keep one of them. Like, you are maybe compromising your own floor balance, and Trae Young hasn't had the greatest shooting season. They're just in such a weird spot where he's older and they still have this number 1 pick and Dyson Daniels, who's not even 22 yet. They're all over the place, but they don't own their own picks. There's incentive to just say, we see kind of an opening here in the East. It feels like there's a power vacuum after, for some reason, Boston and Cleveland. And I know a lot of people think that the Knicks have kind of filled it already. That's debatable. Orlando's injured. Milwaukee's old. The Heat are disintegrating. Look at what's happened to Indiana. If you're Atlanta, there's an interesting window of opportunity here. And you could probably convince yourself that, oh, hey, Jimmy Butler makes us the 3rd or 4th best team in the Eastern Conference. That'd be a team I'd want. Them and the Pacers in my camp, because I root for chaos. I would love to see these teams go after Jimmy Butler. Two other teams worth mentioning. Denver can get there if it's Porter and Najee and Saric are the salaries, and then it's, well, we're going to give you a swap in 26 and then a 2031 conditional first round unprotected pick. It's prided on your other obligations conveying. There need to be another team roped into that deal. So how are you compensating that team to take on, let's say, Saric? Would Miami be willing to send out some type of second or something small to do that? And if you can't, they can make their package a lot more attractive by including a youngster. And so maybe I wouldn't sleep on the Nuggets if it's like, okay, Julian Strother, that 2031 pick, and then Michael Porter Jr. going to Miami. You certainly don't sleep on them if you think it's like Peyton. It's not Brown. If it's Peyton Watson going to Miami, that makes them more attractive. Just now, okay, you have Jimmy Butler and Aaron Gordon, weird fit. And you're worried about the tenability of your core, and you're replacing Michael Porter Jr., who's making substantial money, but he's on the books next year for 38.3. Jimmy Butler's probably making more than that. So you're increasing your payroll obligations while arguably making, I think Jimmy Butler probably checks more of the right boxes than a Zach LaVine, who's more of a one-way player. But the functional perimeter shooting from Zach LaVine, Jimmy Butler still helps you out in the Nikola Jokic list minutes. And he's certainly more of an intuitive fit next to Jamal Murray. But you're making yourself more expensive, and the spacing with Jimmy Butler and Aaron Gordon on the floor could get really iffy. And we're worried about this team not taking enough threes as it is, even though their offensive efficiency can be through the roof. It's okay. Now your only high volume 3-point shooter on this team, especially if you're getting rid of Strother too, is Jamal Murray. And I guess we have to throw Nikola Jokic into that equation at that stage. However, if it's MPJ 2031 and Strother, and you're getting off of Najee and Saric in the process, I mean, I'm probably doing it. Am I not doing it? I don't know what Denver, because you have to pay Brown and Watson coming up. I mean, gets Jimmy Butler short term enough to where it's okay. We're shrinking our window, but maybe we view this as okay after next season is when more wholesale decisions are coming together, but we're going to keep this core together as it currently constructed through next season anyway. Let's just say throwing Jimmy Butler on there for, a few extra dollars, even though it's more than that. Maybe it doesn't, but you're giving up your 2031 pick in the process. And that's really there's a huge age gap there. We're talking Michael Porter Jr. is not even 27. Jimmy Butler's 35. So 7-8 years there. It's not a no-brainer. I don't think it's a package that would necessarily interest Miami, but if Peyton Watson's on the table, I'm probably walking away if I'm Denver. If you're Miami, that becomes more attractive. But Denver could do it, and they're kind of all over the place, and I don't know what to make of this team anymore. But I would MPJ 2031 and Saric and Najee, if that's getting it done, especially if Miami just wants to spite Jimmy, I might just make that deal without even knowing if Jimmy Butler's coming back. You can't, because you gave up 2031 and Michael Porter Jr., but you would be more flexible then moving forward financially should he just leave. So I don't think Denver's a realistic threat, but I don't know. If we're going to give Phoenix the time of day, Denver's best offer in theory, and they're another team where I think you'd have to rope in like Phoenix. There needs to be a third and maybe fourth team involved. I don't think we could discount it if it was on the table. And finally, I'd be very interested in the Grizzlies. The money that they have to give up to get there, and they're not a team that's going to wants to be expensive moving forward, but Brandon Clark, Marcus Smart, and Luke Kennard, that gets you to the money for Jimmy Butler. Now, they're also probably going to want to include so Marcus Smart, Luke Kennard, and Brandon Clark. They're probably going to try and get off of John Conchar there because they want to stay. I would argue, especially with Jimmy Butler's next deal, and they're thinking about Jaren Jackson Jr.'s next contract, they're not paying the tax this year. Could you rope in a team that would take on a John Conchar, maybe even the Pistons have the cap space where if Miami wants pure expiring money, what can we give the Pistons? Do we give the Pistons a first round pick to take on Brandon Clark and John Conchar, and they send Tim Hardaway Jr. to Miami? And that just now Miami gets an expiring contract. It probably costs them a first. Wouldn't you rather just get the 2 first though? I'd probably rather take on that money if I'm them. However, then you get into some roster spot lingo. But if you include John Conchar in there, and then let's say the Grizzlies take back Alec Burks, I have them like taking on under $3 million. So it would be, if you could just find another team to take on Alec Burks, which I think a team would be willing to do for nothing, you can make this trade while being basically a net even by staying out of the tax, let's say. And now you've kept Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. and John Morant, and you own all your own first round picks moving forward. So 2 first round picks in this package, is that enough? I don't know, because of the way that Marcus Smart's money will be viewed by the Heat specifically, but certainly league wide. You probably, if you're getting Jimmy Butler, I don't think that, I know he's injured. Uh, I would include Gigi Jackson, or I would include Vince Williams Jr. Or Scottie Pippen Jr. Like, I don't know that I'd give up 2 of those guys, but I would give up Vince Williams or Gigi Jackson. Like, if you're getting Jimmy Butler, you can give up one of those guys. And so if you're also getting off all this other money in the process, and you believe in Zach Edey and Jaren Jackson Jr. And Jake LaRavia and Santi Aldama, you're not like necessarily too small after. Like, I know you're giving up one of your primary, like, everybody on the Grizzlies is a primary. So there's like your 3 primaries, and everyone just matters a shit ton on the Grizzlies is the way they play. I would want to see this team do it. I'm not giving, like, I'm being very strict with it, because I don't think that he'd have this kind of leverage. I will give you picks, Jalen Wells. No, like, and you're getting off of money you probably don't want. I don't think they want. Conchar has 2 more years left on his deal. They're fine with Clark. I'd probably say he's a net neutral contract at around mid-level money. So you're giving him to Detroit, but it's not as necessarily the most negative asset. Smart's money is kind of the hang up here, because he has Luke Kennard's expiring. That's not a big deal. I would worry. I think this simultaneously makes the Grizzlies a more threatening half-court first chance offense. And then it's, all right, well, you're trading away some guys who conceptually space the floor. So we certainly know with Luke Kennard, but conceptually refers to a Marcus Smart, a John Conchar. So I'm still doing it, but like, now you're towing a very fine financial line. It's so short term. I'm almost looking at any Jimmy Butler deal through the next 2 years, especially if I'm a team that's operating on a longer window. Whereas if it doesn't matter as much, if you're a Golden State, as an example, that what is there other than the next 2 years? But for Memphis, like, they have enough cost-controlled guys where I'm looking at it. I just don't know. What are we thinking? 2 firsts and a Vince Williams, because you're getting off of Smart and Conchar as part of this, and then it's Clark and it's Kennard. Again, it's hurting the framework ends up being Smart, Kennard, Conchar, Clark, and then what else do they have to attach to that package to make it work? And once it moves beyond 2 picks and a Vince Williams, that's maybe where I'm giving it pause. And I know the Grizzlies aren't going to make this deal, but I think they'd be a fun as hell fit. You have Desmond Bane defended well this year, isn't having the best offensive season, but between him and John Morant, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Jimmy Butler, that's still all this depth left over, where, Zach Edey and Santi Aldama and Jake LaRavia are still on this team. And look, Jake LaRavia, I know they declined his team option, but maybe he's someone who has value to someone. Santi Aldama will have value to someone, even as he's approaching free agency. You can't trade Jay Huff, so I don't think his restriction expires this year. I have to look. I don't know when he's trade eligible by, is my point. But like, you have all these different forms of assets, players and picks that you could choose. They're so good that they're not being mentioned among these teams. They're also not on Jimmy Butler's list. At the same time, it's sort of like they're a team where, because they are older than Houston, and you're not talking about giving away all these young players, and I advocated for Houston to at least consider it, but you're not looking at, they're finding a way to play everybody. Injuries have certainly helped. A consolidation might not be the worst thing in the world for them. So if I'm the Grit, I named all these teams, and I've talked myself into, well, most of them should be looking at it. I'm probably not, if we're being really honest, like the Denvers, the Indianas, the Atlantas, the Clippers, of course, feel super unrealistic. Spurs, Kings, and Grizzlies, man, I'm thinking about it. And if I'm the Spurs and the Kings, this is all prided upon what is Jimmy Butler going to do after this season. I'm probably thinking longer about it than a lot of these other teams. But let me know what you think, which team you want to see Jimmy Butler traded to. What do you make of this whole fiasco? Is he even a name worthy of an entire podcast that I just did? Who knows? Please remember to rate, review, subscribe, comment, like our videos on YouTube. That helps the algo love us back a ton. And ratings and reviews on Spotify help us skyrocket up those charts as well. Thank you for all your support as always. If you want to come talk more with us, but also just our fantastic subscribers, community, however you want to call it, join our Discord. The link to that's going to be in the YouTube and podcast description. We have tons of fun in there. Until next time, and as always, I leave you with the shout out to the one, the only, the indelible, bring him home to the NBA, Mr. Frank Ntilikina.